Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 4, Federal Government Reform in the Progressive Era. In 1901, President William McKinley, who was a Republican, was assassinated by an anarchist, which is a person who believes in a lack of government. And this guy had seen other anarchists causing trouble overseas, and he didn't really agree with how McKinley was running the country. So while McKinley's on this great tour, meeting the people and everything, they had a greeting line where the people could come and shake the president's hand and speak with him. And this assassin just walks up to him. Instead of shaking his hand, he pulls out a gun that had been under his handkerchief and shot the president. And as the crowd is trying to attack the guy and hold him down, the one person that is trying to advocate for the man who just shot him is the president, William McKinley, saying, "Don't hurt him, boys." So the assassin is arrested, and McKinley ends up passing away from his wounds. And as we know, when a president dies, the vice president is the next in line, and his vice president was President Theodore Roosevelt. This is a man who was born into New York aristocracy. His family was a high-class New York family, but he had grown up as a child who was really often sick. He suffered a lot of different ailments in his life growing up. And after he got married, he suffered great family tragedy when his mother and his wife both passed away within a couple of days of each other, and he was left with a newborn baby daughter. And he was so distraught that he left his daughter, Alice, with his sister and went off into the frontier of the West. That was before he became president, of course. It is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people and to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid him to do it. This is Roosevelt's belief system as far as what the president's job really is. He believes that the president is the person who is responsibility it is to take care of the people. And he's a different kind of president because of that mindset. We'd not seen a president so involved in the welfare of the people in the Gilded Age for sure. In 1902, Teddy Roosevelt negotiates the Square Deal. And this was a negotiation that leads to some things being fixed. And the problem was between the anthracite coal miners and their management, and it was a labor dispute. The Square Deal really shows what Roosevelt wanted within the presidency and within the country. And what this is a domestic program, meaning a program here in the United States, that reflected on three basic goals: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. And those three C's are things that Roosevelt really advocates for throughout his presidency. Going back to the Gilded Age, we saw a lot of laissez-faire policy or lack of government involvement. Remember, laissez-faire, lazy government. The national government had not really done anything about all this corruption and the monopolies that are taking over the industries until towards the end of the Gilded Age. And remember, Gilded Age and Progressive Era overlap each other, so this is also in the beginning of the Progressive Era. We see the first major regulation being Interstate Commerce Commission in 1886. And this purpose of this was to regulate railroad practices, to prevent unfair pricing, and to regulate how things were run. 4 years later, the government passes the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And the purpose of this was to regulate companies that were restricting trade. But neither one really was used to control monopolies during the Gilded Age. That is until the Progressive Era, when Teddy Roosevelt takes control. Roosevelt becomes known as a trust-busting president. Now, a trust is very similar to a monopoly. A monopoly is when one person or organization controls all of an industry. A trust is when like a couple of companies or 3 companies come together and form, I guess you could say, a merger, and then take over all the industry. So a monopoly, mono meaning one, is one company or organization controlling all of an industry. A trust is when several companies come together and then take over the industry. And either way, Roosevelt saw that they needed regulation. They needed the government to oversee how things were running so that the economy would get better. Because in the late 19th century, we saw a very bad economic recession. And so Roosevelt uses the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the Northern Securities Company, which was a company that had started buying up different railroad companies, and J.P. Morgan was in on it. It was very dirty business. And that ended up leading to a lawsuit that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. But that's not one of the Supreme Court cases that you necessarily need to know at this point in time. Just know that the Northern Security Companies was a monopoly that was taking over the railroad industry, and Roosevelt put a stop to it. Roosevelt busted 25 other corporate monopolies throughout his presidency, and he was president for 2 terms. But he kind of goes a little bit different route because he sees the benefit of efficient monopolies. Like, he believes that there are some good monopolies, but he wants to control the bad ones. And there's a very fine line between what is a good monopoly and what is a bad monopoly. But Roosevelt has his idea and he runs with it, and he ends up breaking up 26 monopolies, maybe more. Also during Roosevelt's presidency, we see the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. If you recall from your previous lessons, Upton Sinclair was a muckraker or an investigative journalist who went into the meatpacking plants and the slaughterhouses of Chicago and exposed in his book The Jungle the horribly dangerous and unsanitary conditions that were happening in those plants. And this causes an uproar in the country when people start reading his book and finding out what they're eating is actually dangerous. So after all of this uproar occurs, Roosevelt pressures Congress to create some consumer safety laws to help protect the people. Because again, he's the president who believes that it is his job to protect the people of his country. The first law that he passes is the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And this means that the government will send in inspectors, government officials, into the meatpacking plants and the slaughterhouses, and they're going to go through that place with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that every single thing, every piece to that operation is happening just as the regulations say it should. And that's going to make sure that you're not getting ground up rats or people's amputated limbs ground up in your meat. And it's also going to make sure that the meat that's being processed is healthy. Because if you recall, part of the jungle was there were cattle that had tuberculosis that were supposed to be disposed of, but instead they were processed and sent out for people to eat. That means that those people that were eating that meat very well could have gotten tuberculosis. Another law that was passed by Congress in 1906 was the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this was meant to hold the people that are manufacturing our food and our medicine accountable for only putting ingredients in there that were actually going to be helpful and healthy to the people. Because before that, you could put whatever you wanted in stuff and there was no government regulation to say you couldn't do it, and people were getting sick. Or they were already sick and the medicine they were taking was not actually curing their illness, but just kind of covering up their symptoms. So if you look at our illustration up here on the left top photo, this is an advertisement for cocaine toothache drops. And it says, instantaneous cure, price 15 cents, prepared by the Lloyd Manufacturing Company. For sale by all druggists. Registered March 1885. Cocaine toothache drops that you could go to any pharmacy, pick one up if your tooth hurt, and then you'd be okay. Well, because you were taking cocaine. This is, as we know, a very addictive drug, and a lot of people were getting addicted, and it was bad for their health. And then the other bottle that we see here, if you look on the right, it says Stickney and Poor's Pure Paregoric USP. 46% alcohol, 1.5 grain opium per fluid ounce. Opium. So it's got 46% alcohol and 1.5 grains opium per fluid ounce. That bottle could be anywhere between 4 to 6 to 8 ounces, and you've got 1.5 grains of opium per ounce. But in the bottom left of our screen, that's the back side of the bottle that has the dosage information. Dose: 5 days old, 5 drops. 2 weeks old, 8 drops. 5 years old, 25 drops. And adults, 1 teaspoonful. Of a substance that is 46% alcohol and 1.5 grains of opium per fluid ounce. Opium is also a very addictive substance. So people were putting addictive substances within those products, and they're not curing whatever it is you're taking it for, it's just covering it up. And the Pure Food and Drug Act says that you are not allowed to put anything in the medicines or the foods that is unhealthy to people. And so that's why we needed that, because you're taking stuff that's horrible. This is also why we now have labels on all medicines and foods that list out exactly what ingredients are in there and how much of them there are. During the Gilded Age, as these large corporations begin to grow, they need more space and they need more resources. So the corporations started to clear out the forests of the United States and exploited America's natural resources. This angered Teddy Roosevelt very much because, as we discussed before, this is a man who had been sick all his life, moves out to the frontier, gets strong, gets healthy, and has the opportunity to tour the nation's best and most beautiful resources. And he believes that those resources need to be preserved for future generations. So Roosevelt begins the first national environmental conservation program, and he's actually the father of the national park system as well. His regulations lead the government to protect 195 million acres of land for national parks or forests. And these are very common ones that you hear of quite often, such as Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Big Bend National Park, Hot Springs National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Forest. These are all government-controlled preserves that if you were to go there and try to cut down a tree, for example, unless you had explicit government permission, you could get in serious trouble, because Roosevelt wanted to protect the nation's beauty for future generations like you guys. The Reclamation Service placed natural resources such as oil, trees, and coal also under federal protection, so the government could keep an eye on things and regulate how those natural resources were being used so that they weren't being exploited. In 1908, we've got another presidential election, and Roosevelt decides that he's going to follow George Washington's precedent and not run for a third term. Up to this point, there is no presidential term limits. Every president previously had really just looked at it as George Washington was our first president. He was the one who set the example. So we will only be two-term presidents at the most as well. But there's no law that says that they have to only run for 2 terms. At this point, you could honestly run for as many terms as you could get elected for. But Roosevelt decides he doesn't want to do that. And he decides he's going to move on. His presidency from 1901 to 1909 greatly affects the United States, and he impacted great change on the nation. For the first time, the government presumed responsibility for the welfare of the people, regulated big business, and protected the environment. And his foreign policy also helps to increase America's influence on the world stage. He had been a military man and helped us win the Spanish-American War. And now we're not a self-contained nation anymore. By the time Roosevelt's president, we are starting to initiate our influence on the world and become the beginnings of what we would become a world power. He also is very influential in the construction of the Panama Canal. Because of his prominence in the Spanish-American War, he sees that we need a way to get quicker and safer passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and vice versa. And he does this through the Panama Canal, which we'll talk about in the next unit. So if Roosevelt's not running, he's going to handpick his successor. And his successor is William Howard Taft. Taft had a lot of the same ideas that Roosevelt did. He was a very progressive thinker. He agreed with a lot of what Roosevelt had to say, and so he seemed like the perfect choice for Roosevelt to support in the 1908 election, and he wins. Like Roosevelt, Taft pushes for a lot of progressive reforms. He breaks up twice as many trusts as Roosevelt. He establishes the Children's Bureau and the Department of Labor, as well as enacting a lot of child labor laws to make it to where kids did not have to work in dangerous and often tragic conditions, as well as allowing those children to go to school so we can start educating the nation's people. He also fights for safety codes for coal miners and railroad workers to make those industries safer for the people as well. But there's 2 sides to every coin, and Taft sometimes sided with the conservatives, the people who believe that things are okay the way they are, and they don't necessarily need change. And Taft angered progressive Republicans when he supported high tariffs, which helped large corporations. A tariff is a tax on imports and exports. So basically, when a manufacturer in the United States creates something and they want to sell it overseas, we charge a tax. If somebody in Great Britain, for example, is selling the United States something, we also pay a tax. And taxes are not bad. Taxes are how a government gets their money. Taft also allowed 1 million acres of Roosevelt's land that he had set aside for conservation to be sold to businesses to do the same things they were doing in the Gilded Age. So he was undoing some of Roosevelt's major national park and national forest conservation program. Roosevelt and other progressive politicians were very disappointed in Taft's performance. And so he's got to figure out what to do. Taft has essentially gone in and bungled everything that Roosevelt wanted. So in 1912, Roosevelt decides he's going to run for another term. But the Republican Party had already picked Taft as their candidate, and you can't have two Republican candidates running for the office in the final presidential election. So Roosevelt forms a new political party and calls it the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party. The nickname comes from a phrase that he often was heard saying, that he was as strong as a bull moose. Just like in our current presidential elections, presidents have to campaign. They have to go out and try to get support. So on October 14th of 1912, Roosevelt was campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And he had this whole speech planned later that day. It was a 50-page speech. And he's at dinner with his cabinet members and like his friends. And he's going out to the car to go get in the car to go to his speech. And this man named John Schrank comes out and shoots him. Schrank was kind of crazy. He had been a barkeeper and kind of gone off the rails. And he said that the ghost of William McKinley came to him in a dream and begged him to avenge his death, pointing to a portrait of Roosevelt. And so this is why Schrank decided that he needed to go and shoot Teddy Roosevelt. So Schrank comes out as Teddy Roosevelt's going to the car, and he shoots him once in the chest. Schrank is arrested, and they get in the car, and his friends are like, Colonel, we're going to take you to the hospital. We're going to get you taken care of. And this shows you how charismatic of a man he was. Because he's not driving. But he convinces everyone in the car and his driver, like, no, guys, we're not going to go to the hospital. We're going to go to the speech. So they go to the speech, and he's still bleeding. And he opens his speech saying, "Friends, I shall ask you to be quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. But unfortunately, I had my manuscript, so you see, I was going to make a long speech. There is the bullet, and there is where the bullet went through, and it probably saved me from going into my heart. The bullet is in me now, so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will do my best." And then he proceeds to talk for an hour and a half. When he finally does go to the hospital, they're like, "Okay, Colonel, we're going to pull the bullet out." And he's like, "Nope, sew me up, I'm good." And Roosevelt actually lived for the rest of his life with a bullet in his chest. Complete side note, but interesting story. The election of 1912 becomes a three-way race. William Howard Taft wins the Republican ticket. Roosevelt is a Republican but running on the progressive Bull Moose ticket. And you've got Democrat New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson running in between. Now, the issue with third parties is they do often split the allegiance of voters for one of the main parties, and that's what happens in the Republican Party in this case. Third parties often focus on issues that the main parties ignore. So Taft didn't really change much, neither did Roosevelt, but Roosevelt is sticking to his guns on all of the progressive reforms that he had enacted previously. Because Republican voters are divided between Taft and Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson wins the election of 1912. Now, this is where it gets very complicated, because had only one Republican run for political office there, that allegiance would have been together. So to make this more clear, look at your map here. This is the political map from 1912. 27.5% of the popular vote goes to Roosevelt. 23% goes to Taft. Had the Republican voters either all voted for Taft or all voted for Roosevelt, the Republicans very easily could have won the election. But because those voters' allegiance was split, some voted for Taft, some voted for Roosevelt, Wilson gets 42% of the popular vote and ends up winning the election. Woodrow Wilson oversees a great wave of political progressive reforms. Most of those are in the form of amendments. These are 4 amendments that you must remember. The 16th Amendment created the first national income tax. The 17th Amendment allowed for direct election of senators, and 18th prohibited alcohol, which is prohibition. And then the 19th Amendment finally grants women's suffrage or women's rights to vote. You must remember these progressive amendments, ladies and gentlemen. So to recap the amendments that we need to know at this point, you need to know our Reconstruction amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th Amendment makes slavery illegal. 14th Amendment says that all people born in the United States are citizens and have the rights and protections under the Constitution. And the 15th allows for African American men to vote. So the easy way to remember the Reconstruction Amendments, free citizens vote. And then you also need to remember the Progressive Era Amendments. And we will add a couple more amendments here and there as we move forward in the timeline, but those are the ones you need to know at this point. Wilson regulated big businesses by pushing for the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is sort of an extension of the Sherman Antitrust Act and protects workers' rights to strike. He also creates the Federal Trade Commission to monitor unfair business practices. Woodrow Wilson creates the Federal Reserve System in 1913, and he does this as a means of regulating the economy by adjusting the money supply and interest rates. The Fed, or the federal government, regulates the amount of money in circulation as a means of keeping the economy strong. This is why we cannot just print more money to pay for the debt. If you make more money in circulation, that's going to cause inflation. Inflation basically means that your money isn't worth the same amount. Because, guys, paper money is only worth the amount we believe it's worth. It has to be backed by precious metals like gold and silver. So if you add more money in the circulation, that's actually going to bring how much the money is worth down and cause prices to increase. Not good. So to wrap up the Progressive Era, for the first time ever, we see the government beginning to regulate big business. Working and living conditions for regular citizens begin to improve. Women's suffrage finally passes, and after almost 100 years, women get the right to vote, as well as new state ballot reforms increase democracy for the people. This is things like your initiative, referendum, and recall that increase voter participation in the government, as well as the 17th Amendment, which allows for direct election of senators. This means that people can now pick their senators who have to do what who they will believe that will do what the constituents say. But by the time 1917 rolls around and we get involved in World War I, we see the end of the progressive era, and we will talk about World War I in the next unit. This brings us to an end of our progressive era unit. See you back here for Unit 3, and I hope you have a great day.